In 1928, Germany was throwing a party, jazz clubs packed, unemployment at record lows, a young democracy finally finding its feet. 5 years later, that democracy was dead, and the man who killed it had been elected. Here's what nobody tells you. Germany's fall wasn't caused by hyperinflation. That nightmare ended in 1924. It was caused by a single day, 4,000 miles away. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. The crash that broke America broke Germany worse. Or as Finny likes to say, the scariest thing about rock bottom, sometimes there's a basement. This is that story. Welcome to Finny Chronicles, where history meets money, power meets consequence, and every story is a warning somebody ignored. Let's rewind to 1924. Germany had just survived the unthinkable. Hyperinflation had erased savings, destroyed trust, and nearly torn the country apart. But somehow, improbably, Germany stabilized. A new currency, a new government, a new chance. They called it the Goldene Zwanziger, the Golden Twenties. Berlin became the cultural capital of Europe. Expressionist art, experimental theater, scientific breakthroughs. Unemployment dropped, wages rose, middle-class families started believing again. Like Finny says, hope is a hell of a drug. The problem is the hangover. But here's what they don't put in the highlight reels. This recovery wasn't built on German strength. It was built on American money. In 1924, American bankers designed something called the Dawes Plan. The idea was simple. America lends Germany money, Germany pays France and Britain pay back America. Everyone wins. The machine keeps running. Except, what happens when America wants its money back? Between 1924 and 1929, American money rebuilt Germany. Factories reopened. A steel worker in Essen finally had steady wages. A shopkeeper in Munich could stock her shelves again. Billions of dollars flooded in. The Nazi Party, those angry extremists shouting about revenge and racial purity, won less than 3% of the vote in 1928. 12 seats, a joke, a fringe movement most Germans laughed off. The future looked bright. And then came October 29th, 1929. In 2 days, the American stock market lost over $14 billion, roughly $250 billion in today's money, gone before lunch. Speculation, over-leverage, blind optimism that prices could only go up. Sound familiar? Within weeks, the panic spread. Banks collapsed, credit froze, and American investors did what anyone does when they're scared. They wanted their money back, all of it, now. Like Finny puts it, when American banks sneeze, the rest of the world catches pneumonia. Those billions in loans, American banks started calling them in immediately. Germany had built its entire recovery on borrowed time and borrowed money, and now the bill was due. The speed of Germany's collapse was breathtaking. In 1929, German unemployment sat at 1.3 million. By 1930, 3 million. By 1932, 6 million. That's not a recession, that's a social earthquake. 1 in 3 German workers had no job, no income, no way to feed their families. Unlike hyperinflation, which destroyed savings but kept people employed, this time there was no money and no work. Imagine being 22 years old, educated, ambitious, desperate, and every door you knock on is closed. Like Finny says, an idle mind is the devil's playground. 6 million idle minds is the devil's theme park. Into this chaos step the extremists. Here's something most people misunderstand about how democracies die. They don't get murdered, they get abandoned. The Weimar government faced an impossible situation. If they spent money on relief, they risk another inflation crisis. If they cut spending, people starved. They chose austerity. They chose wrong. Chancellor Brüning slashed government spending, cut wages, raised taxes. He believed fiscal responsibility would restore confidence. Instead, it accelerated the spiral. And while the moderate center argued about budgets, 2 parties offered something simpler. The communists promised revolution, the Nazis promised restoration. Guess which message won? In 1928, the Nazi Party won 2.6% of the vote, 12 seats in parliament. Cranks, conspiracy theorists, nobody took them seriously. Then the Depression hit. 1930, 18.3%, 107 seats. July 1932, 37.3%, 230 seats. In 4 years, the Nazis went from political punchline to the largest party in Germany. How? 3 ingredients: blame, spectacle, promises. The Nazis gave Germans enemies to hate. Not abstractions like global markets, but people. faces, neighbors. They gave them somewhere to belong, rallies, uniforms, flags, a movement that felt powerful when everything else felt powerless. And they gave them promises: jobs, bread, dignity, pride. Like Finny says, the best salesmen don't sell products. They sell the version of yourself you wish you were. Was it built on lies? Absolutely. Did 6 million unemployed workers care? Not enough. Economic trauma doesn't just empty your wallet, it empties your future. When a man loses his job, he doesn't just lose income, he loses identity, purpose, the ability to look his children in the eye. Meanwhile, the Democratic parties offered nuance, patience, trust the process. You know what nuance sounds like to someone who hasn't eaten in 2 days? Silence. Like Finny puts it, starving people don't want a recipe, they want a plate. Hitler offered a plate. It was poisoned, but it was full. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, not through revolution, not through military coup, through the democratic process. President Hindenburg, a conservative war hero who despised Hitler, made the appointment because he thought he could control him. The elites believed they could use Nazi energy to stabilize the country, then discard the movement when convenient. They were catastrophically wrong. 1 month later, the Reichstag burned. 1 year later, democracy was dead. 6 years later, the world was at war. 12 years later, 60 million people were gone. This is what happens when economic pain meets political opportunism, when hope dies and hatred offers to fill the void. The Great Depression didn't make Nazism inevitable. There was nothing preordained about Hitler's rise. Other countries suffered the same collapse and didn't choose fascism, but the Depression made extremism possible in a way it hadn't been before. It shattered the fragile trust in democratic institutions that had barely taken root, and it created conditions where a message of hate could sound like a message of hope. We're not in 1932. The parallels aren't perfect. They never are. But the patterns? Those are worth watching. When people feel abandoned by the economy, trust erodes. And when trust erodes, outsiders emerge with simple answers to complex problems. Like Finny says, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhythm section is always economic anxiety. Every person in this photograph had children to raise, futures to build. They weren't born extremists. They were made desperate. And then they made a choice that destroyed the world. The lesson isn't that we're doomed to repeat it. The lesson is that we're not exempt from it. That economic stability isn't just about stock prices and GDP. It's about whether people can see a future and believe the system works for them. When that belief dies, anything can fill the void. So pay attention, not with fear, but with clarity. Because the forces that broke Weimar, despair, division, the seduction of easy answers, those forces never left. And citizens who understand that the easiest answer is rarely the right one, those are the only defense democracy has ever had. Because, as Finny says, the greatest trick extremism ever pulled was convincing desperate people it was hope. If this story gave you chills, you're exactly where you should be. Every week, Finny Chronicles uncovers one true story of money, power, and the choices that changed everything. Hit subscribe, because the next story, how a single bank failure in 1930 turned a recession into a global catastrophe, is one you won't want to miss. History doesn't stop, neither should we.